My brother auctioned our family land while I was in the hospital with appendicitis, and he made sure the gavel fell before I woke from anesthesia. I was 29 years old. The land was older than the state, 240 acres of oak and hickory, a creek that ran clear year-round, the farmhouse our great-great-grandfather built in 1876 with timber he milled himself. It was the only thing my father had left me, the only thing he'd ever been able to give, deeded in his final hours while my brother stood in the hallway calculating the value per acre. That morning, I'd woken with pain like a knife in my side. My brother Caleb drove me to the hospital, unusual, unprecedented, the first time in 10 years he'd offered help without asking for something in return. I should have known. I was stupid with fever, stupid with trust, stupid in the way that lonely people are stupid when family pretends to care. "Don't worry about the closing," he'd said, helping me into the passenger seat of his truck, the one he'd bought with the first loan against the land. "I'll handle everything. You just get better. The closing, the refinancing." The deal I'd spent 6 months negotiating with a conservation trust that would protect the land forever, that would pay off the debts Caleb had accumulated against it, that would let me keep the farmhouse and 20 acres while preserving the rest as wilderness. Caleb had agreed, reluctantly, angrily, with the sullen acceptance of a man who'd never understood why our father had left the land to me instead of him, the eldest, the son, the one who deserved it. I trusted him. Not because he was trustworthy, but because I was dying a little, because the pain was making me soft, because some part of me still believed that crisis could transform a person, that facing my mortality might make him face his own. The surgery went well. Appendicitis caught early, routine. I woke to fluorescent lights and morphine and a nurse who wouldn't meet my eyes. Caleb wasn't there. He'd left after signing the consent forms, after assuring the staff he was my emergency contact, my next of kin, my brother who would handle everything. He handled it. While I was unconscious, he'd called off the conservation deal. He'd found a developer, the kind who builds subdivisions with names like Oak Hollow after clear-cutting every oak for miles. He'd sold the land, all 240 acres, for cash, upfront, no contingencies, a price that was 40% below market because the developer knew a desperate man when he saw one. Caleb used the money to pay his debts. Not all of them, he owed more than the land was worth, had owed for years. Gambling and bad investments, and the kind of opportunities that always required more money than they returned, but enough to keep his creditors from breaking his knees. Enough to buy him 6 more months of pretending to be a man who had his life together. I found out 3 days after surgery. I was still in the hospital, still on painkillers, still believing that the Conservation Trust was finalizing paperwork and the land was safe. A registered letter arrived, the developer's attorney informing me of the sale, of my obligation to vacate the farmhouse within 90 days, of the generous offer to sell me back the 20 acres surrounding the house at 300% markup. I called Caleb. He didn't answer. I called again and again. On the 5th try he picked up. "You're awake," he said. "Not how are you, not I'm sorry, not I can explain. Just you're awake, like my consciousness was an inconvenience. Like my existence was a complication in a deal he'd thought would close while I was still under. You sold it," I said. My voice was strange, distant, the voice of a woman who just learned that her body and her birthright had been cut out in the same week. "I had to," Caleb said. His voice was the voice he'd always used, reasonable, Pewterpawn, the victim of circumstances that were never his fault. The debts were crushing me. The conservation deal was taking too long. This was clean. "Fast, done, you'll get your share after I settle everything." "My share," I repeated. 40%, he said, "after expenses. Maybe 50 if the creditors are reasonable." I did the math. Even at 50% after his expenses, I'd have enough for a down payment on a condo. Maybe. In a city I didn't want to live in, far from the creek where I'd learned to fish, the oak where my father was buried, the hickory my grandmother had planted the year I was born. "You sold the land," I said again, not asking, stating, trying to make the words real enough to feel. "I saved us," Caleb corrected. "Saved the family name. Kept the creditors from taking everything. You should be thanking me." I hung up. I lay in the hospital bed and I stared at the ceiling and I felt something I'd never felt before. Not grief, I'd buried that with my father. Not rage, I'd burned that in the years of Caleb's borrowing and temporary setbacks, and just until this deal closes. Absence, the feeling of a life that had been amputated while I slept, the phantom limb of a future I'd planned, the ghost of a self who'd believed that heritage meant something, that stewardship mattered, that love could be measured in acres preserved rather than dollars extracted. I was discharged the next day. Against medical advice, still bleeding internally, still on antibiotics, still with stitches that pulled with every movement. I took a taxi to the land. To my land. To what had been my land. The developer's surveyors were already there. Orange flags marked the property lines. A bulldozer sat at the edge of the north field, where the wildflowers grew thickest in spring, where my father had proposed to my mother, where I'd planned to scatter his ashes when the time came, ashes that were still in my closet, waiting for a burial that would no longer be legal. I stood at the fence. I pressed my hand to the post my great-great-grandfather had set, the one with his initials carved in weathered initials, ELM, 1876. I felt the wood, warm from sun, solid from time, indifferent to my grief. Then I made a promise, not out loud. Just in the part of myself that Caleb hadn't sold, the part that still believed in things like justice and restoration and the possibility of a world where heritage couldn't be auctioned while you slept. I will come back for you, I promised the land's ghost. I will come back, and I will buy you $1 at a time. And Caleb will watch me give you away to everyone he owes. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're here, maybe you know what it means to wake from surgery and find your birthright sold for someone else's debts. Maybe you know the particular horror of watching surveyors mark the wildflowers where your father proposed. Maybe you know what it's like to press your hand to a fence post older than your state and swear to the wood that you will not forget. If that's you, subscribe. Not because I have comfort, because I have $1. And because the story I'm about to tell you ends with me standing at a closing table, watching my brother sign over his last asset, while the land he sold sat in a trust that would outlast his name. Here's my story. I didn't fight the eviction. Not immediately. I was weak, healing, living in a motel paid for by the last of my savings, while Caleb's 40% kept being delayed by expenses and unexpected complications. I hired a lawyer, a young woman named Priya Sharma who specialized in elder fraud and fiduciary abuse, who took my case on contingency because she saw in it something that made her angry. He had power of attorney, Priya said, reviewing the documents. Your father gave it to him when he got sick, before he changed the will. Caleb used it to sign the sale documents while you were incapacitated. Technically legal, the POA was still valid, but ethically, she shook her head, we can fight it. We can sue for breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, maybe criminal charges. How long? I asked. Years, Priya said. And even if we win, the land's already sold. The developer's breaking ground in 60 days. Best case, we get money. We don't get the land back. I thought about this. I thought about years of litigation, of Caleb's countersuits and delays and bankruptcy filings, of watching lawyers consume what little I had left while the bulldozers erased my family's history. I thought about winning and still losing, about Pyrrhic victories and hollow justice. No, I said, we don't sue. Priya looked at me. She was young, idealistic, still believed that courts could restore what was broken. What then? She asked. We buy it back, I said. $1 at a time. She didn't understand. Not then, but she would. I got a job, 3 jobs actually. I waitressed breakfast shifts at a diner near the hospital. I cleaned offices at night, vacuuming around desks where people made in a month what I needed to save in a year. I took online surveys for pennies, sold plasma for dollars, participated in medical studies that paid for the privilege of making me sick in controlled ways. I saved every dollar. I lived in a room the size of a closet, ate food from the diner's discard bin, wore clothes from donation boxes. I didn't date, didn't travel, didn't buy anything that wasn't necessary for survival. I became a machine for converting time into money, for converting money into land, for converting land into something Caleb could never sell again. It took 2 years to save the first payment. $20,000, enough for down payment on 5 acres. The worst 5 acres, the steep rocky patch at the southeast corner that the developer had planned to use for a retention pond. I bought it through a shell company, a trust with a name that meant nothing, Hickory Heritage LLC, using a lawyer in another state who didn't know my story. I didn't visit. I couldn't risk Caleb finding out. I just owned it. Paid the taxes. Watched from satellite images as the subdivision rose around it, as Oak Hollow appeared on maps, as the retention pond was built on adjacent property because my 5 acres made the original plan impossible. The developer was furious. He sued the shell company, claiming eminent domain, claiming necessity, claiming that one holdout was preventing the orderly development of the project. The case dragged on for 8 months. I hired another lawyer, paid from my third and fourth jobs. I'd added night stalking at a grocery store and weekend transcription for medical records company. I won. The court ruled that my property rights were valid, that the developer would have to redesign around me, that Oak Hollow would have an irregular shape, a missing tooth, a visible reminder that not everything could be bought. By then, I'd saved another $30,000. I bought 10 more acres, the creek frontage, the best fishing, the place where my father had taught me to cast, another shell company, another lawyer, another parcel that made the developer's plans more expensive, more complicated, more frustrating. This became my life. Work, save, buy. Work, save, buy. I learned about land trusts, conservation easements, the legal structures that could protect property forever. I learned about Caleb's creditors, his debts, his growing desperation as each sale I made more difficult reduced the value of what he thought he'd already converted to cash. The developer sued Caleb. The sale contract had included warranties, clear title, no encumbrances, peaceful possession. My purchases weren't encumbrances, technically, but they were complications. Expensive complications. The developer demanded Caleb cover the legal costs, the redesign fees, the delayed construction penalties. Caleb called me, first time in 2 years. His voice was different, smaller, tighter, the voice of a man who'd run out of people to borrow from. "We need to talk," he said. "We are talking," I said, "about the land, about what you're doing." He paused. "I know it's you. The lawyers traced the shell companies. You're buying back the land I sold. You're making this impossible." "Yes," I said. "Why?" His voice cracked. "I needed that money. I saved us. I kept the creditors, you kept yourself," I said, "for 6 months. And now you're broke again. And the land you sold is worth less because of what I'm doing, and the developer wants your blood, and you called me because you need someone to save you again." "I need you to stop," he said. "Please, just stop buying. Let me sell the rest. Let me get clear. I'll pay you back." You sold our great-great-grandfather's land while I was unconscious," I said. My voice was steady. The voice I'd built in diners and offices and medical studies. The voice of a woman who'd learned that time converts to money, converts to land, converts to justice. "You sold the oak where Dad proposed to Mom. You sold the hickory Grandma planted. You sold Dad's ashes in their urn because you couldn't wait for me to wake up and say no." "I was desperate," he whispered. "So am I said. "Desperate enough to work 4 jobs. Desperate enough to eat garbage. Desperate enough to spend 2 years buying back what you stole 1 acre at a time. And I'm not stopping until I own it all, or until you own nothing. Whichever comes first." I hung up. I went to my 5th job, overnight security at a warehouse, where I sat in a booth and studied property records on my phone, where I found the next parcel, the next purchase, the next piece of my family's history to reclaim. It took 7 years total. 7 years of work and save and buy. 7 years of Caleb's decline, the creditors closing in, the developer's judgments piling up, the house he lived in, our parents' house, the one he'd inherited because someone needed to maintain it, going into foreclosure. 7 years of watching him shrink, not just financially but physically, spiritually, the man who'd once sold my birthright now selling his own furniture to pay for groceries. I bought the last parcel, the farmhouse itself, the 20 acres around it, the place where I'd planned to live and die, at Caleb's bankruptcy auction. He sat in the front row, wearing a suit he'd owned for a decade, watching me bid against the developer who'd originally bought the land, who'd spent millions trying to build around me, who was now tired of fighting. I won with a bid of $180,000, the exact amount, I would later learn, that Caleb had received for the entire 240 acres, minus his debts and expenses. Every dollar he'd gained, I'd spent to undo. Every acre he'd sold, I'd bought back. Every profit he'd imagined, I'd converted into loss. After the auction, I walked to him. He didn't stand. He looked up at me with eyes that were old, defeated, the eyes of a man who'd finally run out of escapes. "You won," he said. "No," I said, "the land won. I was just its witness." I walked out. I didn't look back. I heard him crying as the auctioneer packed up, as the developer shook his head and walked away, as the room emptied of everyone except a man who'd sold his family's future for 6 months of borrowed time. I didn't keep the farmhouse, not for myself. I signed it over, the farmhouse, the 240 acres, every parcel I'd bought back, to a land trust. The Hickory Heritage Trust, named for my grandmother's tree, protected forever. No development. No subdivision. No future Caleb could sell. No future developer could clear. No future generation could auction while someone slept. I kept one thing, the fence post. 1876. I dug it up legally with the trust's permission, and I moved it to a museum, a small local history center that told the story of our county's founding families. The post stood in the lobby with a plaque. This land was saved by the stubbornness of women who refused to forget. I visit sometimes. I press my hand to the wood, warm from the museum's heating, solid from time, indifferent to my grief but present for my gratitude. Caleb lives in a rented room now. He works at a gas station, the night shift, the kind of job that doesn't ask questions about bankruptcy or bad debts or why a man in his 50s is pumping gas for minimum wage. I see him sometimes when I drive through for coffee. He doesn't look at me. I don't look at him. I have nothing left to say, but I heard a story about him last month. A customer at the gas station, a developer looking at rural properties, asked Caleb if he knew of any land for sale. Good acreage, something with potential. Caleb shook his head. He looked at the man with eyes that were old, defeated, but also finally honest. There's no land around here that's for sale, he said. Not really. Not the kind you're looking for. The good stuff's all in trusts now. Protected. Saved by people who understood that you don't own land. You just borrow it from the future. The developer left. Caleb went back to pumping gas. And I drove away with my coffee, smiling at the thought of my brother finally telling the truth. I'm Eliza. I'm 38 years old. I'm a daughter who woke from surgery to find her birthright sold, who worked 4 jobs for 7 years, who bought back her family's land 1 acre at a time and gave it away to everyone her brother owed. I learned that the opposite of cruelty is not kindness. It is persistence. It is showing up every day until the stolen thing is restored and the thief is left with nothing but the memory of what he briefly held. If someone ever sold what you loved while you couldn't stop them, or if you're still working 4 jobs to buy back what should have been yours, drop a deciduous tree below. I read every single comment. And if this story made you want to fight for what was taken, hit subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. What are you finally ready to reclaim? Backhand index pointing down.